What would you say if someone told you that they were going to take a large box, attach some balloons onto it, and then use it to fly from Japan to the United States? Well, there was a man who attempted to do exactly that, and this is his story. Suzuki Yoshikazu, also known as the Balloon Man, was born in 1940. In 1984, at the age of 44, Suzuki established his own company, which operated saloons and pubs where concerts would be held. His pubs were known to release a large number of balloons during the finales of every concert. However, business was not going well, and in the early 1990s his company went bankrupt, leaving Suzuki and his family with a large amount of debt. This is where Suzuki had a brilliant idea. If I fly from Japan to the United States using balloons, I'll make a lot of money from sponsorships and media appearances, and will be able to pay off my debt. Suzuki immediately got to work, and to gather sponsors he decided to do a test flight to prove that flying with balloons was possible. His test flight took place on 1992 April 17th. His goal was to fly from West Tokyo to the East Coastline, maintaining an altitude of roughly 400 meters. Suzuki attached several large balloons to a harness and took off despite local authorities advising against it. Unfortunately, Suzuki had miscalculated the buoyancy of his balloons, and he kept ascending until he eventually reached 4,500 meters, more than 10 times higher than he initially planned. Let that sink in for a moment. Suzuki was floating 4,500 meters, almost 15,000 feet above ground, and the only thing preventing him from falling to the ground was some balloons. Suzuki was still ascending at this altitude, so he cut off a balloon, attempting to adjust the buoyancy. This succeeded, and he gradually fell down to Earth, eventually crash landing on the roof of some random stranger's house. Amazingly, Suzuki only received a few minor scratches and bruises, and despite having gone through a literal life-threatening experience, was still adamant about flying from Japan to the United States. This test flight did bring quite a bit of fame to Suzuki, and people started referring to him as the Balloon Man. Over the next half year, Suzuki created the craft that would carry him across the Pacific. And this is it. Basically a large box with balloons tied to it. He named it the Fantasy. He was going to do another test flight with the Fantasy, planning to ascend to an altitude of a few hundred meters, and then coming back down. It was the day of the test flight, and many TV cameras and spectators had gathered to watch the Balloon Man. Suzuki loaded the Fantasy with oxygen tanks to use for breathing at high altitudes, 1 week's worth of food, a cell phone, various electronic devices such as an SOS signal transmitter, and various other things he would need during his actual journey to the United States. Learning from his mistake of having too much buoyancy during his first test flight, he also loaded over 100 bottles filled with liquid as weights, so he could adjust his buoyancy mid-flight by throwing the bottles overboard. However, there were a few problems. For some reason, Suzuki could not prepare all of the balloons he wanted to attach, and some of the ones he had were leaking, resulting in much less buoyancy than his initial calculations. Suzuki resolved this issue by using duct tape to seal the leaking balloons, and making the craft lighter by unloading all the bottles he had put in as weights, and even unloaded some of his oxygen tanks. He reassured everyone watching that it would be fine, because it was just going to be a test flight. Suzuki boarded his craft, pumped air into the balloons, and to everyone's relief, the Fantasy lifted off from the ground. There were ropes attached to the craft to make sure that it would not drift away. The Fantasy ascended to 120 meters, and came back down. As everyone was getting ready to congratulate him on a successful test flight, Suzuki began untying the ropes anchoring the Fantasy to the ground. When asked what he was doing, he simply answered, "I'm going." and to everyone's disbelief, he again lifted off, this time drifting off across the horizon. It was later found out that Suzuki had told his family to stay at a hotel for a few days, because the media might be all over their house if news got out that Suzuki had departed for the United States. This indicates that Suzuki had intended from the beginning to begin his journey across the Pacific that day, and had no intention of it being a simple test flight. At around 10 p.m. that evening, Suzuki called his wife and told her that his balloons were leaking. He isn't gaining as much altitude as expected, and that he is now over the ocean. At around 6 a.m. the next day, Suzuki called his wife again, telling her that he was gazing at an amazing sunrise. This would be his last words that anyone heard. At around midnight of that day, the Japanese Coast Guard received an SOS signal from Suzuki, and they decide to search for him at daybreak. The Coast Guard sends out search planes as soon as the sun rises, and at around 8:30 a.m., they locate the Fantasy, 800 kilometers off the east coast of Japan, at an altitude of 2,500 meters. The Fantasy was missing many balloons, and the ones that were remaining had visibly lost a large amount of air. The manufacturer of these balloons would later claim that their balloons are not made to withstand extended use, and the balloons would lose about 10% of their air every day. Suzuki waved at the airplane and turned the SOS signal off. The Coast Guard stayed close to the Fantasy for a few hours, but Suzuki kept dumping objects from his craft, which is strange, because if he wanted to be rescued, he would keep the craft heavy to have it eventually land in the ocean. Suzuki kept dumping objects and gaining altitude, all the while waving at the airplane. The Coast Guard decided that Suzuki had no intention of being rescued and headed back after a few hours. Sadly, no one has seen or heard from Suzuki ever since. As previously mentioned, the balloons attached to the Fantasy would lose about 10% of their air every day. Judging by the location Suzuki was last seen at, his altitude at the time, the amount of air left in his balloons, and air currents in the area, it was presumed Suzuki would land in the ocean somewhere in this area. Depending on where exactly he landed, the ocean currents would either push him back towards Japan or towards Alaska. Authorities in the United States, Canada, and Russia were alerted, but none of them reported a Japanese man washing up on their shores. Most ocean experts claim it was unlikely Suzuki could survive in the open ocean with just his box and 1 week worth of food. There were rumors that Suzuki had put life insurance on himself before taking off, and his family was able to pay off their debt with the payout, as he was presumed to be dead. If we are going to be optimistic, we could believe that Suzuki drifted back to northern Japan, or maybe even the United States, and lived the rest of his life in the countryside. However, no one has heard from Suzuki since, and we will never know what really happened to the Balloon Man. Thank you for watching until the end. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. But for now, I'll see you next time.